Christine Colasurdo give us a wave. But first, I'd like to introduce the spiritual leader of the Cowlitz Indian Tribe, Tanna Engdahl. Oh, Tanna, one moment, you are muted. Let's get you unmuted. All right. Give it a go now, Tanna.
All right.
You're all good.
Klahoya. As a spiritual leader of the Cowlitz people, I must adjust the title of this time together from what does Mount St. Helens mean to me to what does it mean to we, Cowlitz. I do not come alone. But also to be clear, I do not speak for all individuals. I speak for the sense of us together. And when I talk about a sense of place, then I'm not just talking about the here and now, but for all time. And for those who have rested untold centuries on this land, and for those who have yet to put their footprint on this earth. I'm reading my words because when I typed, they flowed and followed a certain sequence, and I don't want to lose that. First, I want to put my hands in the air to the next speaker, Rick McClure. Instead of applauding, the Salish put their hands in the air. And it is something more than a standing ovation. Somewhere between a salute and a prayer comes from the heart. It comes from a sense of respect and gratitude. Rick McClure has worked with the Cowlitz people in such a way that he has imbricated a memory on our Cowlitz soul. To talk about Latwet Mount St. Helens, is to speak about its mountain Tamanawas. The Tamanawas is the spirit envelopment of each individual, somewhat akin to a soul, as the Christians know it. But it is also an active guidance, helping us decide when we reach decision points on our journey, and helping us each day be a better person than we were yesterday. Those who have made decisions that were not helpful to the spirit probably now understand the losses involved. So we have a Tamanawas. Latwet has a mighty one. In the great mist time, I use this word mist instead of myth because I'm uncomfortable with our stories considered to be a set of false beliefs. In fact, I think our stories are living testimonies to early education systems to teach and understand behavior protocols. All the stories relate to the time when animals talked. So I use mist time to mean a time when forms might have been more vague and creation as yet unsettled. What one thinks of as paranormal might mean normal in the different environments of ancient centuries and a powered mountain. So, Coyote has many names among many tribes, but we will use one of the dialects, a term that we will use as Juani. Juani was commissioned by the high god to help in creation. Juani danced through time and space and sang the birthing songs. Mountain ranges were created, and the land between became green and lush with hills, canyons, rivers, and prairies. They were ripened by winds, sunlight, moonlight, rains, and of course, mist. To put the crowning glory on these marvels, Juani conjured up a few mountain peaks and gave the two-leggeds that were to come the most glorious mountain peak of all, the Snow Queen, Lawetlathla. As in early cultures of humans and water. In our early story, Lawetlathla witnessed a flood, resulting in our origin story. The highest Sagali Tayi, the great chief of above, told the chief of two-leggeds that a great flood was coming. The chief, two-legged, told his braves to find the largest cedar tree and make the largest canoe ever. He told the women to go to their basket trees and from the cedar weave the longest rope ever. All the women busied themselves with curing and smoking salmon, eulachon, meats, berries, roots, until all baskets were filled. When the rains began, the two-leggeds put their children in the great canoe, chaperoned by a young brave and a girl of 16 years. They attached the woven rope to one end of the canoe and the other end to a giant cliff rock. By and by, the rains filled and obscured the land until even the top of Lawetlathla was underwater. The woven rope tugged on the canoe. One day, one of the children spied a canoe in the distance, and the group watched in elation as the distant canoe became larger. It was not a canoe at all, but the exposed tip of Lawetlathla. Eventually, the canoe touched earth as the waters receded. They were on the banks of what was named the Cowlitz River. Cowlitz, Cowlitz, Cowlitz. Translated as seeking their medicine spirit. And so began the tribe of our resilient people. The medicine seekers, known as Cowlitz, daily gave thanks to the Creator for the food-stocked rivers, the forests that produced the holy cedar, the prairies that grew fresh vegetables, and the mountain of great power. For untold centuries before time was accountable, the Cowlitz have gone to the mountain, individually or in groups, to absorb the energies that transmuted as knowledge, decision points, blessings, and creative thought. The Cowlitz launched their young toward the mountain to find their future as in vision quests. The mountain also held secrets as in a confessional. And when it was time to join the ancestors, many went to the mountain to sing their last song, to gain strength for the next journey. The mountain gave more than its great heart. It gave tangible things such as meat, berries, clothing, at different elevations, like different floors in an elevator. The Cowlitz knew one thing. They knew why this mountain was so special. It burned with a fire within. The name Lawetlathla translates as one who smokes, the smoker. It had a life force that could change geography and extinguish life. The two-leggeds humanized the stories of these transmutations to the level of human expressions, such as a jealous wife and husband. There are many quarreling husband and wife tales, either with Lawetlathla, Patu, Mount Adams, or Taxoma, or Takhoma, Mount Rainier. There are also jealous wife stories. The quarreling wives of Patu ended in warfare between Tlahuatlatha and Taxhoma, with Tlahuatlatha prevailing because of the ability to throw fire. The sex of this triangle of giant peaks change intermittently in early recordings, depending on the geographic and cultural viewpoint of the teller. The stories were recorded by the new people, bent on capturing the history, concepts, culture of the ancient people. Further south, East, or Mount Hood, comes with an abundance of stories. The mystery of Tlahuatlatha and surrounding lands harbor stories of unusual phenomenon. One being the Stiatko, later to be dubbed as Sasquatch or Bigfoot. The Stiatkos traveled through the centuries, mostly as an adversary or irritant to the two-leggeds. They were giants, having near full body hair, exuding a stench when they were close enough to smell, and throwing rocks and sticks if encountered. Stories say they threw rocks and sticks at dwellings, and of course they were feared, especially when there were disappearances. My grandmother would say, "Eat your vegetables, or the Stiatkos might seek you out." My grandmother believed the Stiatkos were a different species, one that was in decline. Current sightings have indeed become more rare. I mentioned the different elevations. As one goes higher, the air is thinner, and one labors to keep the body moving. A little more effort and concentration is needed. This transition time of the body is one that affects the senses. Tlahuatlatha is a mecca for today's hiking outdoor society. Those who approach the heights might open up to more than just what is seen, but what is felt. Because one is never alone on the mountain. Camouflaged animals are ever watchful. The ancestors sometimes travel the trails. The tamanawas of the mountain, Tlahuatlatha, waits to baptize unaware travelers at random intervals. So here, I tie up my story and give it over to Rick. Oh.
With all of us, and mine will be a little different. Can everyone hear me? Is this working? Oh, great. Well, I'll start off just with a little story about how I became acquainted with Mount St. Helens. It was 45 years ago this year that I made a trip with a buddy to climb Mount St. Helens for the first time. And we did it by an unusual route. We followed the Forsyth Glacier directly to the summit, and we used it as an opportunity to do some crevasse rescue training. And since the eruption of 1980, I'm just still amazed that this glacier no longer exists. The crevasses that we descended into and came out of no longer exist. How in just one instance, these features can all be wiped away from the landscape. It's a humbling thought. So that was a long time ago, 45 years ago, and since then we've had the eruption of 1980. I was in graduate school in Pullman at the time, so I got to experience the ashfall that, as I would learn later, so many of the native people that lived around the volcano experienced time and time again, because there have been so many eruptions of the volcano over thousands of years. So for 34 years, I'm retired now. For 34 years, I worked for the Forest Service as an archaeologist. I was trained in archaeology and cultural anthropology, both at Evergreen State College and Washington State University, so pretty local. And I was fortunate enough to get a job with the Forest Service and to pretty much spend most of my career in one place. I started as a district archaeologist working in the Cowlitz Valley area, and then became the Heritage Program Manager for the forest. And at that time, back in the 1980s, there really had been very little archaeological work done in the drainages that surround Mount St. Helens. So it was kind of a new world in terms of learning what we could about past human activity in and around what would become the monument. During the 1980s and 1990s, we began to see a pattern in the excavations we were doing at archaeological sites of repeated layers, sequences of volcanic tephra and ash from Mount St. Helens. And it brought us together with USGS geologists and working with people like Donald Molyneux, David Yamaguchi. We were teaching ourselves how to identify these ash and pumice layers, identify the different eruptions of Mount St. Helens that they were associated with. And the one that really stood out, because it's so massive, it's so widespread, and the thickest of the eruptions, thickest of the pumice and ash layers that come from Mount St. Helens, was what Molyneux called the Y tephra. It's large in size compared to other tephras, and it comes from what was called the Smith Creek eruptive period of Mount St. Helens. And we began to see a pattern in the archaeological record of, we had occupations underneath that pumice, and then in looking at our radiocarbon dating sequences above that eruptive layer, above that ash and pumice layer, we saw that in some places, the area had been abandoned. People had actually left the area for some time before coming back and resettling on those same places. So it really gives you an idea of the impact of an eruption of that size, how it affected resources, how it affected the things that the people depended on for their survival. So people undoubtedly left the area for a while and then eventually drifted back into those same places and lived there up until the time of historic contact. Anyways, it was a very interesting pattern that emerged. It showed us that people living in the shadow of that volcano have had a very intimate relationship with the mountain. And that then leads into the oral traditions and the legendary stories that come to us from the elders of the different groups that lived around the mountain. In working on the archaeology and understanding the potential effects to the people around the mountain, I became familiar with the oral traditions, the historic recordings made with elders, many of whom were alive in the middle of the 19th century. Their knowledge goes back to the time of their parents and their grandparents. It takes us back to the beginning of the 1800s even, and beyond that, connected back to their elders going way back in time. And some of the most profound stories, Tanna shared one of those with you, show us really the very powerful importance of the mountain to the people that lived in the valleys around it. So moving from the archaeology into the cultural side of things, trying to understand the people who lived in the shadow of this mountain. We came into a time in the late 1980s where archaeologists and tribal people, tribal communities were working more closely together. And in that work together, I think many of us as archaeologists were learning for the first time that there was a different way to look at this landscape, and that it wasn't just little isolated archaeological sites across the landscape, that everything was interconnected and that the landscape itself was a cultural resource, that our definitions of what cultural resources were had to really change, had to evolve. So we began to look at landscape features, at interconnected landscape features as cultural resources in a way that we had not. And this was being done across the country, and tribal communities across the country were engaging with government agencies and asking them to consider the importance of places of significance to their histories, to their culture, to their spiritual beliefs, to understand features of the landscape as historic sites, just as we would historic buildings. The National Register of Historic Places was created in 1966, and over the years, tens of thousands of historic buildings were listed on the National Register as our nation's list of the highest and most important historic places. But very few sites of significance to tribal communities had entered into the register. So in 1990, the government issued guidelines for how to include places of significance and importance to communities like tribal communities, how to nominate and list them on the National Register, that they too should be considered significant and important as national treasures, as were a tavern that George Washington had a beer in, or a home of Thomas Jefferson. That all of these places should be equally important. So with those kind of new directions and guidelines, we marched forth on the Gifford Pinchot National Forest to attempt an inventory of places that might qualify, that might rise to that level. And it was a 3-year project. We received special funding. We enlisted the help of some of the most noted historians and scholars in the area, Bob Boyd and Eugene Hunn, to name a couple. And then tribal members of the Yakama Nation were hired to conduct a whole series of oral history interviews. Oral history interviews were conducted with representatives of both the Cowlitz and the Yakama Nation, assembling just a really incredible body of important information about the landscape and how it was used. The landscape on the 1.6 million acres of the Gifford Pinchot National Forest, including the monument. So the result of that, 3 years later, was a list of 256 places that were of cultural significance to the Cowlitz and the Yakama people. And 52 of those were places that were considered by the people that were interviewed to be sacred. They called them sacred places, places of spiritual power, places where special beings lived. And of course, at the top of that list, Mount St. Helens, Lawe-Latla had the largest number of individual references and sources of any of these sites. So it was a few years later, after the Cowlitz tribe had received their federal acknowledgement, Forest Service had worked up an agreement document. The chairman, tribal council, had worked with Forest Service staff to develop an agreement document on how both entities would work together, how they would work together in the management of fish, wildlife, all kinds of things. And that document, that memorandum of understanding between the Forest Service and the tribe, said that we would work together jointly on some projects, including in the area of cultural resources and cultural resource management. And it was about 2010 or 2010 at a meeting to discuss the MOU that we had a discussion about what would be a good manageable sized project to take on together. And Chairman Bill Ayal was there, Dave Burlingame, who was the head of cultural resources at the time, and myself, Nathan Reynolds, who's now the acting cultural resource management director. We took a look at this list of potential traditional cultural places, and with Mount St. Helens at the top of the list, we all agreed let's pursue seeing if we could have this listed on the National Register of Historic Places. There'd only been one other property like that listed in the state of Washington, and that was Snoqualmie Falls. The Snoqualmie tribe had worked with, I think it was Seattle City Light, on having Snoqualmie Falls listed, actually put on the register. And that was the only other one that had been done in Washington State. There have been none done in the state of Oregon. So, and very few nationwide. So we embarked on that journey together. We had a student intern named John Hand, cultural anthropologist, who started that project, started that work in 2010. And he talked to tribal members, interviewed folks about the significance of the mountain, about its role in Cowlitz identity and Cowlitz history. And we also interacted to a much lesser extent with the Yakama Nation on this. Ultimately, it was about a 3-year process as well. It was nominated to the National Register in 2012 and actually formally listed on the National Register in 2013, February of 2013. And one of the things that you have to demonstrate in making your case for significance is the continuity. It can't just be a place that was mentioned historically as significant to a tribal entity or community. It has to be still important to the group and still acknowledged and recognized by the group. And one of the things we brought out as evidence of that was in the very logo of the Cowlitz tribe. You can see in the background there, behind the salmon, is Lawe-Latla, Mount St. Helens. There it is. So that leaves no doubt, of course, the significance. So that's our story. That's how that National Register listing came about. And in my 34 years working for the agency, it was one of the most gratifying, incredible experiences. The journey of having it listed and meeting and talking and working with people was an incredible experience. And I'm grateful to the Cowlitz tribe, to Tanna and everyone else that we worked with there for working together with us on that. It was a great project, and I hope there are more like that in the future. So I'll now pass this off to our next speaker, Christine Colasurdo, who wrote this wonderful memoir that weaves history and nature, natural history, and personal memoir all together. And look for this book if you can, and I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about it. Christine?
Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Tanna. I first want to say thank you to the Mount St. Helens Institute and all the fabulous people who work for the Institute. It's an honor to be a part of this presentation, and I just can't say enough good things about the Mount St. Helens Institute. It's full of really great people doing really good work, and so thank you very much. For me, I first came in contact with Mount St. Helens as a 7-year-old. And so Mount St. Helens has been a part of my life ever since I can remember. And so when I thought about the question, what does Mount St. Helens mean to me? I realized that depending on what age I've been, the mountain has meant different things. So I tried to write out some notes to explain how the mountain is really not just a mountain. It's really many, many things, a very powerful thing. And in my life, it's been one of the most powerful shapers. So as a 7-year-old, Mount St. Helens was a place. It was a place where I learned how to canoe, how to pick huckleberries, how to hike, how to watch wildlife, how to understand what the natural world is. So it was really a formative place that formed my childhood. My family, I grew up in a large family of 9 kids and my parents, and we would camp every summer at Mount St. Helens at Spirit Lake. And so first and foremost, Mount St. Helens in my life was a place that shaped me. And then as a young person in high school, I got a job at Harmony Falls Lodge. And at that point, I think Mount St. Helens and Spirit Lake sort of became like a state of mind and a symbol for an alternative way of living that you could check out of kind of the American capitalist society and live in a simpler way. The lodge where I worked was off the grid, so there was no electricity, no road. We had some power off a Pelton wheel off Harmony Falls, but it took either a boat ride or a 3-mile trail to get to the lodge. And so it was very primitive, simple living. And I had that as a junior in high school. It was really another thing that really shaped me. And so Spirit Lake became a place that was an alternative to mainstream American society. And I was hoping to go back and have another summer job at Harmony Falls Lodge after graduating from high school, but it was in my senior year that the mountain became active. And that's when Mount St. Helens became an event. So far it's been a place, it's been a state of mind, and in March 1980, it started to become an event, a media event. And then that culminated on May 18th with the cataclysmic eruption. And I write a little bit in my book about how odd it is that a place becomes an event. But that is really what Mount St. Helens is to a lot of people, especially people who have never been there. They just know it as a mountain that erupted in 1980. That event kept going because the mountain erupted continuously for 6 years. And so it became a way of life for Pacific Northwesterners. Ash falling, anxiety about your health, mask wearing, some of the things that we have now with the coronavirus, a lot of anxiety about an uncertain future. So that was a big deal. That was the most profound event in my life. And it came at a rough time because as a young person, I was very attached to the area and really saw my future as being at Spirit Lake. So then after that, as a young adult, Mount St. Helens became a thing to avoid. And I didn't talk about it, and I didn't go up there. You couldn't go up there because all the roads had been destroyed and all the bridges were washed out. And it was closed to the public for many years, for six years as the mountain was active. And so it was really a post-traumatic stress response. And I really didn't like talking to people about Mount St. Helens. I especially didn't like talking to people when they said things like, wow, you know, what a spectacle, or what an amazing thing. And for me, Mount St. Helens was a place of great death. I knew a lot of death from the eruption. I knew beavers and elk and birds, great blue herons, river otters, rough-skinned newts. I had this knowledge of what was living up there at the time. And they were all my friends. They were with me. I was a part of that landscape and they were a part of me. And so Mount St. Helens as a 1980 event was a huge death event for me. And I think people forget that 1980 was a tremendous loss of life. And that area is a graveyard. It is a giant graveyard. And it's been exciting to watch life return, but we first have to remember that it is a graveyard. And then as I grew older and was able to face what the eruption was in my life, the mountain really became a teacher. So Mount St. Helens is a teacher. And when I started working on my book and walking the blast zone and finding places that I had known as a child, the mountain took on this totally different aspect, which was mountain as guide and mountain as instructor. And so I became curious about my own past and about the mountain's past. Then after that, as I the more I became involved in Mount St. Helens in the current time, Mount St. Helens became a place to protect. It became a thing to protect. I've helped work on stopping a road across the pumice plain. I've helped out trying to fight logging sales up there. And for 10 years, we've been fighting a mine on the north boundary, right outside the north boundary of the monument. And now we're fighting another road across the pumice plain. So Mount St. Helens has become this fragile thing that where life has returned, and yet people want to come back in and do things. They want to put their impression on the landscape again. And so there's that aspect to Mount St. Helens. I think where I end up with what Mount St. Helens means to me is Mount St. Helens as changer. I think if I could name the volcano, because we all know that Mount St. Helens is an inadequate name for that mountain, right? We have the Cowlitz name of Lawalapla. Thank you, Tanna, for saying that. And that's really what that mountain should have as a name. We have instead this name of this English baron who never set foot in the United States, and it has really nothing to do with that Cascade volcano. But I feel like my personal name for the mountain is the changer. And I think that Mount St. Helens is always one step ahead of us, always a little bit beyond our comprehension, an eternal mystery that is always changing and always dynamic and always sparking us and keeping us present and vigil and paying attention. It's a tremendous place of power. It's a place of spirit, and always a little bit beyond us. And I think in that way, the mountain is, like Tanna said, a place of tamanawis and a place of healing and great spirit. It's a wounded landscape. Mount St. Helens is a wounded landscape. And that's sort of where I end up, is that as a wounded landscape, it has self-healed over the last 40 years. And I feel immense gratitude that I've been able to work through my grief, my judgments, my anger, all these, this whole portfolio of human emotions about this volcano. I've just gone through all of them, and I've come to a place of gratitude that in my short lifetime, I've been lucky enough to know Spirit Lake and know what was lost on May 18th, 1980, and then to live through this great healing of the landscape. It's just been amazing to be present and to watch that happen. So I'd like to end now by reading a poem that I wrote for the 35th anniversary of the eruption. I wrote this poem 5 years ago. It's called Cascade Manifesto. And it kind of sums up what Mount St. Helens means to me. And of course, Mount St. Helens is just one volcano in the Cascade Range. So this poem is called Cascade Manifesto, an open letter to residents of the Cascade Range. So this is to everybody who lives along the Cascade Range. We live in a land of volcanoes. We live in a land of earthquakes and volcanoes. We live in a land of landslides, rockfall, debris flows, mud flows, avalanches of snow and ice, avalanches of pyroclastics. We move through a moving landscape, a land alive beneath our feet, beneath our houses, beneath our schools, beneath our streets. We move beneath a sky of moving mountain, of glassy ash, blizzards of earth drifting down to settle as the forest's next percolated layer of rain-soaked soil. This morning I awoke not thinking of volcanoes. This morning you awoke not thinking of volcanoes. But every day we live in a land of volcanoes, connected like the very molecules of air we breathe, connected by rivers, by wind, by seeds, by seismicity, geography, our own history, that we chose to live not on a stable aged plane, but in this steep, sliding, slithering, continuous collage of the 40 millennia old, 800-mile-long Cascade Range. It can't be driven in a day. It crosses 3 states, 2 countries, expands north and south as one geologic link in a multi-continental crustal chain of fire, a crumbled cause of contrast and paradox, volcanic, non-volcanic, old, new, wet, dry, clear-cut, not clear-cut, public, private, east-facing, west-facing, low, high. Some of us are Californians, some Canadians, some climb Shasta, some Tahoma, some neither climb nor hike, but look and remember, what we call living is a tectonic lull. What we call civilization is a sizable moment between cataclysm and cataclysm. We are tenants between eruptions. If you can see a volcano, it can kill you. If you can't see a volcano, it can kill you. Air, it comes down to air. Cascade volcanoes cause chaos on land, but only air for hundreds of miles, a sphere of influence that widens through time. Thus, let our motto be the mountains. For all of us drink rainwater and spring water clarified by volcanic filters. All of us feed on roots and leaves grown in crushed bits of summits, delivered in inches and millennia by rivers. All of us praise or complain of weather created by the Cascade Wall, where Pacific storms collect as a conspiracy of clouds, knock their sodden loads, and reign forever. All of us come from or go to one volcano or another. Are you headed north to Shuksan, south to Mazama, west to Lavglakla, east to Pato, Klaklani, Komulkushan, Wayist, Komyamani? There is always a volcano at your back, always some peak before you, always the scent of pine, cedar, hemlock, fir, indigenous to this place of layers, of stratum upon stratum, earth upon earth, tropical fossils and fossilized forests, stratovolcanoes baked like rocky cakes, hot eruption upon hot eruption, a frosting of mudflow here, dark, deep filling of scoria there, crunchy topping of porous pumice. We eat this cake. We are this cake. Our layer is this layer now, and then there will be another layer. We live in a land of volcanoes. They are as gods on the horizon, gods of rock and ice, killing us, feeding us, informing our days and imaginations, sending us news of fresh petals or fresh pumice. We live in a land of volcanoes, an old land that grows young with each eruption. Pull back the corners of your day and you will find dacite, rhyolite, basalt, obsidian. We have the mountains to know what we are. We have the mountains to know where we are. We have the mountains to know where we've been and where we're going. Thank you for listening. And now it would be great to have some questions and talk. I have a question for Tanna and Rick. If that's okay, could I toss a question out, Taylor?
Yeah, I believe everyone should be back and on the live stream. So go ahead, Christine. Thank you so much for sharing that poem with us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for listening. So Tanna and Rick, in my book, I write about how people call the mountain by a female pronoun. And for me, the mountain is beyond gender. It's not female or male. It's way bigger than that. It's spirit, right? And I was just wondering if you, Tanna, you mentioned that in the native stories, in the Cowlitz stories, there's the jealous wife. There is a personification that happens. I'm just wondering, you personally, if you look at the mountain in a gendered way.
Go ahead, Tanna.
Sometimes, sometimes I do, but I also feel at certain places, I feel a masculine energy. So I don't know that the mountain comes as one or another. Certainly it comes that way in some of the stories. But I think that's the personal journey of each one who goes there. What do they feel? It's not for me to say how you feel. And as I said, for me, it comes one way, then it comes another way. So I don't know that your answer or the answer to your question can be definite, nor does it have to be. It is how it feels to the one who experiences it.
Thank you.
I hope that answers it.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, personally, I think I've taken the non-gender specific approach, and it's for two reasons, I think. Aside from just being on the mountain before and after the 1980 eruption, what I think about is snow and cold. I've experienced a lot of that up there. Sideways, vertically, yeah. But looking at the oral traditions from indigenous people, north to south, and then west to east, up to Columbia Gorge, it's interesting how the gender of the mountain changes. For some indigenous people, it was a male entity. For others, a female entity. And the jealousy working, with different characters. But the name that is most often used, Lawilatla, if you dissect that linguistically from the Ichishkan language, the personifier at the end of that word is gender neutral. It's not male or female. So that's kind of the scientific answer to the whole thing, I guess.
Thank you. Thank you.
Other questions out there?
I have a question for you, Rick. When was the first time that you encountered Mount St. Helens, or what was maybe the first time that you really felt its power to you?
Well, I mentioned that at the beginning, 1975. Here are my crampons from 1975, these funky old two-piece things. They look like they belong in an antique shop. I felt the power being down inside a crevasse, 60 feet down inside the ice on the side of that mountain was a pretty humbling and solitary experience, a lonely, solitary experience. You can't hear anything except maybe water dripping, and you're in another world. And it was a very humbling experience. Yeah.
For me, I wasn't born in 1980, and so I experienced it maybe in 1999. I'm from Chicago originally, and I came out with my family, and we did a road trip in Oregon and Washington and up into BC. And we stopped at Mount St. Helens, and I remember very clearly looking out over a ridge line, and all of the trees were down, and there wasn't as much growth then as there is today. And I remember so clearly it looking like a giant's foot. And I remember it looking like toes on a giant's foot, and all of the trees that were down looked like hair on a giant's toes. And Christine and I, a couple of years ago, worked a program where we were on the north side, and I actually have a copy of her Cascade Manifesto with me that she had given me that day. And I remember really thinking that maybe I could find that spot again and compare this photo that I had taken with my parents' camera back then, and find that same spot. And I couldn't even recognize it, because even in, less than 20 years, it had grown over and it looked completely different. And so I haven't been able to find that spot again, but it just really struck me when Christine and I were on that program, like how quickly it had changed in less than 20 years, and that I could see the difference even in my lifetime.
Dynamic landscape, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think Mount St. Helens is definitely a place that teaches us that land is not the backdrop to human drama. Land is the story. That we Homo sapiens, we think we're running around and that we're the main story. But I think at Mount St. Helens, you really learn that we're only little ants running around, you know? And the land is the story, and the story is ever changing. So there isn't ever, you at the minute that you take a photograph of Mount St. Helens, that photograph is already on its way to being obsolete, right? Because the trees are growing taller, everything's changing so dramatically. But yeah.
Tanna, do you have a story of when you experienced the 1980 eruption?
I was in Washington, D.C. I was working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so my immediate concern were my relatives, many who lived around the mountain. I had relatives, Tootle and Castle Rock, Kelso, Longview, and places north. And I had two uncles, elderly uncles, and I was extremely concerned. And of course, as you might know, you couldn't get through on the phone. The phones were jammed, and many people were trying to call the relatives. And I managed to get through and found that everyone in our family was safe. And so I did prayers. But as I was watching television about that was going on for days, as you know, one of my uncles was on TV being interviewed by CBS, and is my oldest uncle, and he had a very gruff voice. His first language was probably not English. He was very, his English kind of came through a French pronunciation, but he certainly was giving that reporter a good lesson why that mountain exploded. Of course, we were in the process of land claims and recognition, and many of our people believe that the anger the mountain itself felt, its people, we were the people, we were its people. So the mountain itself felt our grief and frustration and anger, and at the same time, of course, it knew our resilience because we came through all of that. Our losses, the losses of so many people during the epidemics, much like we're going through today. We understand what it's like to have the losses of the population. We feel that mountain felt that, picked it up, and reacted. So that was the belief of some of our people. For myself, I never take issue with any of the beliefs of our people.
Somebody in the chat had a question that the 1980 blast was felt really far to the east, not just in this region. And someone is asking you, Tanna, if you have any insight if there are First Peoples stories from other regions besides just that of the Pacific Northwest. Are you aware of any?
Oh, my goodness. There are so many origin stories. I used to live in the Southwest among the Pueblos and the great Navajo Nation. I lived in New Mexico. But I traveled a lot with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And every tribe, every people had an origin story. And to try to even give one, these stories are not short and in time bites. So I won't embark on one. But there, if you go to Google, and a lot of us do, and look up different tribes or look up origin stories of Native Americans, I'm sure you'll have dozens of opportunities to hone in on some. The Pueblos were interesting because in their encounters with the new people, sometimes quite violent, they literally took their prayers and their holiness and their understanding of the sacred underground. They became kivas, and that was their sacred place to gather. And not many outsiders ever get to visit a kiva. I'm fortunate to have been invited by special invitation to one of the most, not necessarily remote, but most protective of its culture, and that's the Hopi. If you ever want to read a most fascinating book, you can read the Book of the Hopi. This was not written by natives, but it was written in consultation with some who would speak to Frank Waters. Frank Waters is a very well-known writer. He's gone now. But I met some of the people that he consulted with for that book. And there's so many more. You could spend a lifetime reading about Native America, contemporary novelists, Sherman Alexie, Louise Erdrich, our Scott Momaday, our Pulitzer winner. Fantastic books, deep books, books that grab you in the gut. So if you are ever bored with having to be self-sheltered, grab a book about some Native American people, and you're off on a journey, a fantastic journey.
Thank you, Tanna. Rick, we have a question here from Marsha Williams, and they're saying that Elk Mountain, they feel like, is a very spiritual and significant place, and they're wondering if there's any sort of historic register of Elk Mountain, if you've ever heard it, if you're familiar with that.
No, I visited Elk Mountain many years ago, and I know Dave Burlingame, when he was cultural resource manager for the tribe, was very involved with further investigations there. It's private land, so permission to access the site is through the private corporation that owns it. It's difficult to get permission to go up there. As far as I know, it's not listed. Pending further investigations. I think further documentation was needed of some kind, and that was something that the tribe was working on. It's outside national forest land, so I didn't have jurisdiction over it when I was working for the Forest Service.
Now, Tanna, you had a reaction to this question. Do you have something that you'd like to share?
I could have talked about Elk Mountain, but I didn't.
Here's your chance.
No, I'm not going to talk about Elk Mountain because I know what's there, and we don't need people traipsing up there. The fact that it is private is two sides of a blade, because there's many things that we need to do there as Native work, as Cowlitz work. And at the same time, we're glad that the public can't storm the site. I'm sorry it was brought up. But I will say that I have a cousin, and I will give his name, Michael Hobbs, who early on was given the obligation to try as best he could to take care of that site. So I know he does in his prayers, and I know he does the best he can because it is private land, and he's shut out of it, as we all are. Some of us have had the privilege of making that very difficult climb to that mountain. But yes, I know a lot about it, but perhaps someday I will write about it, but not now. Just not now.
Thank you. We do have a question for Christine from Ben Burke. He says, hi, Christine. Do you have any plans to write a Mount St. Helens book? Another Mount St. Helens book?
Actually, hi, Ben. Thanks for your question. I am working on a very long project. So I'm working on a book that's been going on for the last 20 years. This book project is about tracking Mount St. Helens over a very long time. So my first book was written in a 2-year span and has a lot of text and not very many photos. This book is kind of the opposite of that. It's going to have photos and text, and it's going to be writing a book as a life project. So so that is actually another, it's sort of like chapter 2 for me of writing about Mount St. Helens. And then I also have a manuscript of poems about Mount St. Helens, and that will probably come out before the other book. But yeah, I've got two literary projects around the mountain. I consider Mount St. Helens an ongoing relationship, and so I will probably write about Mount St. Helens and walk at Mount St. Helens for all my life. Yeah, thank you. That question.
Now, as we're rounding near 7, just right after 7 o'clock, I just wanted to give all 3 of you an opportunity to ask any final questions of each other before we close.
I have a question for Tanna and for Rick. I'm wondering if you've ever been afraid at Mount St. Helens. Has there ever been a moment, you know, where maybe you think the mountain might erupt, or maybe there's just something spooky? Have you ever had moments like that?
Tanna?
No, never. The feeling of the Tamanawas and the spirit is so strong that the danger is losing yourself totally in it and becoming so transferred to the other world that you forget to be careful of your body. Fear is not something I really know intimately. Well, I do take that back because of my childhood. But I have such faith in the ancestors who maybe walk with me that no, I don't fear on the mountain. Nothing would surprise me about unusual happenings on the mountain. Nothing would surprise me about feeling a sudden wind or a sudden drop in temperature or a sudden shooting of light or a shooting of darkness. The paranormal, if that's what you're talking about, no, that doesn't surprise me at all, nor do I fear it. So Rick, it's yours.
For me, it's just the opposite, I think. When I go to high places like this, it's a spiritual thing for me to be on top of a mountain like Lawilatla or Kumakulshan or some of these other volcanoes. I feel a connectedness to everything in the universe when I'm in a place like that. So it's just the opposite of fear for me. That's the easiest way to sum it up.
Thanks.
Well, I just want to thank you all again so much. Mount St. Helens Institute is so proud to partner with all three of you and to have you here to speak. And I just want to give a huge shout out. And if I had any more brew left, I would cheers you all. But thank you so much for being here, truly. And for all of you watching, we're going to close, but this is not the end of Mount St. Helens programs online. We are hosting many different programs, which you can find on our website at mshinstitute.org under our new campaign of MSH Inside. Next week is the 40th anniversary of the 1980 eruption, and there are many different virtual programs that you can join, and we are going to have a little bit of a hub on our website where you can choose many different programs to participate in throughout the week and throughout the year, because it's going to be the 40th anniversary all year long. So next Friday as well, on May 16th, you all are welcome to join us. We have longstanding board member Bill Nye doing a 45-minute presentation at 6 on May 16th. There's a Facebook event as well as on our website. And we hope that if you enjoyed this program, consider making a donation on our website. And once again, thank you so much, Christine and Tanna and Rick, for joining us. And we hope to explore the volcano with you all soon.
Thank you, Taylor.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Tanna. Thanks, Rick.
Same here. Same here.
Can we give a shout out to the Portland Art Museum for their great exhibit that's been extended? Is that right?
Yes, it has been extended, and there may be some things that are available online in the coming weeks, so that those of you that haven't been able to see it in person might be able to have a chance to do a little bit of a virtual walkthrough.
It's a
Hats off to curator Dawson Carr for bringing all of that stuff together. It's really a phenomenal exhibit.
He did an amazing job, and it's a beautiful exhibit. Just that we have the historic paintings in that first gallery, it just is amazing. Really,
yes.
Really amazing.
And they've been great partners for us, and we just are really proud to have so many wonderful organizations and groups to work with here in the Pacific Northwest. So once again, thank you all so much, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Hey, I guess Christine already left, but we're done with the live streaming. I just wanted to come in and thank you all again very much and tell you how much I appreciate your time and the effort you put into this. It means a lot to us. It means a lot to me.
Thanks for hosting this.
Yes.
Thank you both so much. It was
Thank
really
you
great.
for all the technical help you've given us too. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you so
A learning experience, right?
yeah, for all of us. So.
All right.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Take care,
Bye.
everybody.
Oh, all right.
Bye.